Welcome to the Bells I Hear podcast. We will speak with experts who will debunk the myths and misconceptions surrounding homelessness and highlight the innovative approaches for addressing the issues, causes, and consequences of housing insecurity. I am Elisa Smith, your host, a mentor, professor of legal studies, and former public defender. Thanks for tuning in to the Bells I Hear. Today on The Bells I Hear, we are beginning a series on exploring programs focused on youth development. In this episode, we will be talking about educating children with Dr. Deborah Kenny, who is the author of The Well-Educated Child and founder of Harlem Village Academies. She will share with us how she built one of the best schools in the country and how her book provides a roadmap for expanding her vision and approach for education. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Kenny.
Thank you for having me.
So I did read your book, The Well-Educated Child, and I found it both inspiring and heartbreaking because I think so few children are getting the opportunity to get the education you describe. So I'd like to start with what you mean by the well-educated child.
You know, what you're saying, it resonates with me personally as a mother and professionally because I feel like my own children, even though we were fortunate enough to have them attend a really good public school in Westchester County, still did not get the quality of education that I wish they had I known then what I know now. And I've been my whole life, really 4 decades overall, working in education, but it took a real struggle to learn what I learned. It was an uphill climb. And so part of the reason I wrote the book is so that educators and parents will not have to go through all that my colleagues and I went through to learn everything we learned to finally get the schools where we wanted them to be. And so that all the decades, if not really century of wisdom about what comprises a great education, is available in this very concise, clear format of the book, The Well-Educated Child. And to answer your question, I define a well-educated child in three big ways, and that comprises the three chapters in part two. One is quality thinking, and that means that a young person is a really sophisticated thinker. They know how to discern between misinformation and valid information. They're independent thinkers, but they're also very, very knowledgeable. They they aren't thinking independently off the top of their head, but rather when they encounter information, they really take a stance of humility,
Mhm.
which is to say, "Gee, I don't really know enough about this. Let me read a lot before I form an opinion." Right? So these are just some of the examples. There are many more in the book of what comprises quality thinking. The second is agency, which means that a young person is educated to take initiative, care about the quality of their work, be persistent, and that's what you want for your kids. You want them to have a sense of responsibility and accountability and drive and to care about their own character, to care about the quality of the work they do. And the third component of a well-educated child, a well-educated person really,
Mhm.
is a sense of ethical purpose. And what I mean by that is that over the course of their education, they come to understand, I was put on this earth for a reason. What is my purpose? You know, what is the purpose of my life? What will I contribute to the world, within an ethical context? And that's really important. In some sense, The first and second are a means to a third and to a fulfilling life.
Right. And this model that you're talking about, it seems so succinct, but it took years and years of you having conversations with experts, and there was a lot of trial and error that came through in the book, which I really appreciated, because sometimes I think people read things and they think, "Oh, look how easy this was." This was this was not easy. And you had to pull together an entire village of people. And so your book is really about what you've done at Harlem Village Academies, and the success of that program. Could you tell us what inspired you to develop Harlem, the Harlem School?
Oh, yes. In the beginning, it's two different stories. What inspired me 10 years ago um, to search for deep, more profound ideas um, is one thing, but you're asking what was inspired me to start the schools in the first place.
Yes.
Basically, what had happened was um, my children were in third, fourth, and fifth grade, and my husband and I were living in Westchester, and he got leukemia, and after 18 months, he died, and they were by that time 11, 9, and 8 years old,
Mm.
and I was um, uh, just profoundly distraught over a period of a year. I couldn't sleep at night, so I would
Mm.
read. And I came upon a quote in the book Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, who was a psychologist in the concentration camps in World War II. And he said, um, and with a group of men who some of whom were persisting through all the difficulty. And he wrote, "We had to teach the despairing men that it's not what does life have to offer you, but what is life asking of you?"
Yeah. Uh,
And that really lifted me up because I was at a place where I didn't care about myself or my life, but that quote, that idea was saying, "Well, it's not about you."
mhm.
There's something life is asking of you. At the same time, I was reading books by Jonathan Kozol, um, about the plight of um, low-income children stuck in failing schools, and my heart really went out to these children and their mothers. And I had a doctorate in education. I had that background in teaching, um, and just thought, well, however much I'm suffering, I think these children and mothers are even more so. And I just thought, well, maybe that's what life is asking
Uh,
of me. And so I decided, and this was at a time when there were only two charter schools in New York State. In New York, in fact, the law had just been passed the year before. Governor Pataki got the law passed by tying it to a pay raise for the legislature in the middle of the night. And so there was one school that had been around for 1 year, one that had been around for 2 years, and that was it. So, yeah, so that was the initial impetus.
wow. It's an inspiring story because you took what was a tragedy in your life, and you created this amazing opportunity for other people, which I just think is so selfless. Um,
Well, I didn't create it alone. I mean,
no.
it was this founding group of absolutely brilliant teachers. I mean, I still, to this day, remember each one of them and how they taught and how profoundly committed they were to it. It was definitely a group effort.
Oh, yes, and that comes through in the book, that this was you brought together and you kept bringing in people to challenge and to inspire and to change. You definitely get the sense of always aspiring, always wanting to do better and to do more through the book. Uh,
Yeah, that is true. I think that is um, something that has become part of the culture of the schools, actually,
yeah,
is this continually improving. Yeah,
yeah,
and always aspiring to excellence.
yeah. It's like this idea of the dialectic. You're always in the process of becoming. There's always something
Yeah,
to improve, right? Um,
yeah.
let's talk a little bit about the focus of Harlem Village Academies and its success and the students. Like, who are the students that go there, and what is the structure of their school day? How does that, what are the practicalities of a day in the life of these kids?
Oh, you mean just the basics.
Yeah.
Well, so we started with one school. We now have 2 elementary schools, 2 middle schools, a high school, a college support program, and a teacher, graduate, uh, training program. And our idea was always quality, not quantity. You know, we wanted to we wanted to provide the children in Harlem, and I was originally inspired by Jeff Canada, the CEO of Harlem Children's Zone. He's the one who inspired me to work in Harlem,
Mm,
and I met him. I believe it was 1999, and I was just enthralled with him. He's so charismatic
mm,
and so um, deeply committed. So um, you know, but in terms of practicality, so this the we aspire to provide the kind of education that private school kids get. And that is to say that in addition to the core subjects that, our kids have lots of arts experiences. And every school now has, for example, a musical theater production. And each one of these things is thanks to particular individuals. It's not me, it's the people who started these and felt passionately about what the kids deserved. We have opening and closing circle in terms of the structure of the day. Um, and in the upper grades, that's called advisory, where the students have a chance to bond with each other, feel a sense of belonging, feel a sense of closeness with each other, talk about things that are on their mind, resolve disputes, offer acknowledgments and apologies. And it has been, it's interesting. This is just one example. There are many. This idea that children need to feel emotionally grounded, and that not only is that valuable and important in itself, I mean, ask any parent or educator, but it also supports cognitive development and academic achievement. And this has been proven by cognitive science now, um, but it was also known to educators for, I'd say, the last at least half century, if not more. Um, so, just like every school, there's recess. People don't often understand how important recess is. The little kids, the pre-KK, they have blocks. They have a good amount of playtime. Play is how young children learn. Early childhood educators are now, need to defend this notion, but it's the wisdom of those early childhood educators that has sustained the private school protection of the play, and well, any one of these things I could end up talking about for so long. But and then another part of the structure of the day is that kids who need extra help, whether it's tutoring or homework help, will get it on a regular basis after school. So along with chess and sports and all the other enrichment activities, there's always tutoring available for the kids who need it.
mm,
So we have this concept of keeping pace rather than catching up, meaning if a student is behind, you don't want them to get behind because then they're struggling with that material as well as the new material. You want to preempt that by tutoring the kids that you know are going to be struggling. And how do you know? Well, because of the assessments you do early in the year,
Right.
and observing the students' work. So, um, those are some of the examples of the structure.
Do students, um, do they stay in, for years and years? So do they start like in kindergarten and stay through 12th grade and go on to college from there?
Oh, a lot. Yeah, I mean, a lot of kids do, but there's the same attrition as the regular
Mm.
schools, in any given year, a percent of kids will move out of town or will, move away for some reason. Um, but they they now, it used to be they came in 5th grade for the first 10 years. Now they come in kindergarten. Now they come in pre-K.
Oh, wow.
So,
Okay.
yeah.
So these kids stay in school together, for a while.
Well, actually, because there's a campus in East Harlem and a campus there's sort of East and West,
Okay.
by the time they get to high school, they combine into one group of kids. Um, but the question you were asking about structure, I think what other educators, would find interesting or applicable would include some of the structures for teachers as well, because we have time during the day for teachers to plan lessons together and to study the books that the children will be reading. We have professional development once a week. Uh, um, we do everything we can think of to support teachers because nothing's more important than quality teaching, and that requires supporting teachers. Obviously, it also requires hiring the best and brightest. And once you do, really listening to them and really being open to feedback and making sure that they're getting the exquisite quality professional development that they need.
Yeah. How do you define success? I mean, I know that your vision of success has probably changed over the last 20 years, but how do you define success, especially in an environment where I feel like we rely so heavily on tests and grading schools and that kind of an approach to youth development and education. I think you take probably a different approach. So
Yeah,
what is your definition of success for education, for teachers, for students?
that's such a good question because my definition is very different than what's standard in the world. And in fact, people called us a high performing school, from our third or fourth year and said we had closed the achievement gap. And said to myself, well, that depends on how you define achievement. Now, I will say there's sort of two answers. One is I would define it by looking at what does it mean to be a well-educated child and have we achieved that? And I devote an entire chapter in the well-educated child to a vision for educators and parents to understand, well, what does it mean? What are we aspiring to? What does it mean to be well educated? But beyond that, what you're asking about is, well, how do you know if you've achieved that as a school? How do you measure it? I will start by saying what I don't believe in terms of measurement. So it's really the story of, it started in 2007. We were in our third and fourth year. We had 100% of kids passing a math test. In another year, were number one in all of New York State, and that brought a lot of attention. We had a visit from the President of the United States, look at this school, close the achievement gap, high performing. And already the inner angst began for me because I felt, well, all they mean is that the kids passed this test, and I don't want to completely diminish the importance of that because after all, we're talking about, when Jeff Canada said to me, I'd love for you to focus on Harlem, look at the need here. The statistics were just heartbreaking and unconscionable. Kids were going to school not learning how to read, and unable to do math, that, as Bob Moses says, algebra, was the gateway to calculus and to higher achievement in math. If you can't read, that's how the prison construction industry knows where to design and build the next prison, is based on fourth grade reading failure rates. So we can't completely um, say that these tests mean nothing. And the whole idea of analyzing the quality of a standardized assessment is so above my pay grade. It's so complicated. You really need to know what you're doing to even begin to talk about this. But what I will say is that I certainly wanted much more for our students than passing a standardized test, and did not believe that that was the measure of success. So that was sort of the beginning of this decade and a half journey
Mhm.
that brought us to where we are today. I did not want our kids to take the AP exams because it was just a lot of memorization. Um, Similarly, the state regents exams. And so I was seeking out curricula or assessments that aligned with my vision.
Mm.
Fast forward, we now have Montessori for the younger students and the International Baccalaureate for the older students,
Can you
which
tell us yeah,
exactly.
what that is? Like what those
Yeah,
'cause that was one
sure.
of my questions is I think most people probably don't know what Montessori is and they don't know what the
Yes.
International Baccalaureate education is. What does it mean? Why is it important?
As educators, as a nation, we're doing a disservice to our children by not teaching them how to write well, because we don't require that. And I think it could be that it's too expensive to um, grade, so they the schools don't teach it as much as they would otherwise. But if the whole goal is the quality of thinking, then there are two ways you can measure that. One is discourse. If kids are sitting around a Socratic seminar and you're qualitatively evaluating their insights and the quality of their evidence, and another is writing. You can tell how smart someone is by reading something they wrote, and you can tell how well read, how knowledgeable, how sophisticated they are by reading what they wrote. Conversely, you know, writing is, as my friend Donna Santman always says, writing is a mediator for thinking, right?
Oh yeah.
So, so the assessments need to include oral exams and writing. Next is deeper learning. Well, the one practice that encompasses all the many aspects of deeper learning is the research paper, the research project. Now, when we were kids, we all learned how to do a research project, and we were required to write research papers. It was almost a given that it was obvious that it was part of a good education. Nowadays, it seems to have fallen off, but the reason it's so important is that in addition to knowing a lot of things, I think breadth of knowledge is important. Depth is also important for different reasons. It accomplishes something else. When a student spends, let's say, a year studying one aspect of one topic very, very deeply, they come to know what it means to know something well. They now have an insight that will stay with them for the rest of their life into what it means to really understand something. And then if they end up reading about it, they see how shallow that article is compared to, because they studied it so well. This confers a perspective on all the information they'll encounter for the rest of their lives. And they'll realize when they encounter information how shallow it is, how, I better read 20 things about this before I form an opinion about it, And so these are examples of the kinds of things that should be um, defining success, or as you said. And they are exactly what the International Baccalaureate requires. It's a framework, and it's a set of assessments that compel this kind of instruction.
The book and the the Village Academies, the way it operates, these ideas, this framework, what are you hoping that your book will accomplish in inspiring people to perhaps improve education? What are the takeaways you want, and what do you envision how this should happen in society to improve education in public schools?
Well, I think the what is a bit of what we talked about earlier in terms of, you know, designing schools backwards from a vision for deeper learning. And our vision, I actually happen to have it here. I don't know, can you see this?
Yes, the graduate profile. Yes.
Since I was so unhappy, or I would say since I was so dissatisfied with what was being required of students for the state tests, we decided we're going to define our own outcomes. We're going to say what we want for our students by the time they graduate from our K to 12 schools. So we designed this graduate profile around the three ideas that I talked about as the definition of a well-educated child. So in the graduate profile, the attributes and skills that we want for students by the time they graduate from our schools under these three domains are things like, under quality thinking, analysis, problem solving, persuasion, that they can craft a compelling argument, innovation, they can create groundbreaking ideas, intellectual curiosity. These are the things, at being an avid reader, being able to assess evidence, discerning the accuracy and validity of information. These are the things we want by the end of a child's education. Second is under the rubric of student agency, taking initiative, being responsible, working hard with a lot of effort, being resourceful, being persistent, being driven to produce quality work. All of those are around agency. And then under ethical purpose are things like emotional intelligence and respect and integrity and so on. And so what schools can do, and what I would hope, is bring the teachers together, because, you know, teachers have so much more potential and are often overlooked in the process of making important decisions. Bring the teachers together and have them create a graduate profile with the school leaders, and then ask yourself, okay, how are we going to make sure that the curriculum, instruction, and internal assessment that we either adopt, adapt, or create aligns with what we want at the end of that process? And the person who inspired us to do this was actually Grant Wiggins, the late great Grant Wiggins. Um, and this has served us very well because it provides clarity. And one of the things that schools can do is give themselves enough time. Because one of the mistakes I made was being impatient and rushing. And to do it well, it does take time. And so, give yourself the appropriate amount of time. Not too much. I mean, you want to deliberate, but you also, you know, want to get going.
Yeah, so it's interesting because it sounds like when you were reading that list that these would be qualitative assessments. You know, it's not like it's a multiple choice test, did you pass or you fail? It's a qualitative um progress report of sorts. Are students achieving these things? Are
Well, and I think both are valid.
Mhm.
I think some amount of um, let's say, more basic, you know, um, is is appropriate. It's not it but in math, um, 2 plus 2 does equal 4. I mean,
Yes.
there are some things that are worth testing in a direct and objective way. But yes, qualitatively, if a student is working on an essay or an extended essay, then you need a set of criteria, um, a very rigorous process, and we have to be careful, actually very careful, that when we're pursuing these higher order uh, endeavors, that it can so easily devolve into fluff and nonsense. You have to really guard against that.
That's true. That's true. One of the things you talked about in the book, and I don't know that we've mentioned it, or maybe we mentioned it in passing, but you described this idea of fostering a culture of respect and independence. Can you tell me a little bit more about that and why it's important in the education of a child?
So, in terms of behavior versus, respectful behavior versus respectful independence versus agency. This is really a story,
Mhm.
In the very beginning, when we first opened the school, I visited schools in urban areas, mostly in the Northeast, a little bit elsewhere, serving urban children, and they had very regimented behavior systems, all based on reward and punishment, very elaborate infrastructures
Mhm.
for reward and punishment, and it was all about compliance and obedience. Now, I also visited urban schools that were failing schools. So I looked at these two, and my prior teaching experience had not been in urban schools, so this was new to me at the time. And I said, "Well, so you have kids who are not being taught to behave and not being properly supported. So they're running around like wild. They're jumping on tables, throwing pencils, cursing at the teacher. I mean, it was really bad. And then these other schools, the kids seem much happier, um, but they're also being treated like little soldiers. They're all behaving and they're learning. And so I asked myself, well, I mean, are these the only 2 choices? Either they're not safe, they're in a school where fights are breaking out all the time, they're not safe, they're not learning, or they're being, told what to do and micromanaged and, trained to just follow along, and it didn't sit well. So when we opened our schools, I said, well, we're not going to do reward and punishment. We're not going to do a demerit system. We're, and, but I didn't have any ideas at that time for what we would do instead. And this is, again, part of why I wrote The Well-Educated Child, because I don't want other people to have to struggle for 5 years or 8 years to figure out
I was
what
gonna
we figured
I
out,
was gonna say this was the part in the book where I think there was a lot of trial and error, right? There were
Oh my
some teachers that
gosh.
were like, "Well, can we talk about this a little bit?"
Yeah, exactly, because, I we opened with this idealistic notion, and within 3 days, the dean's office was overflowing, and so, there was one teacher who had her kids behaving no matter what,
Mm.
and, if you can have that magical miracle teacher in every room and wave a magic wand, there were other teachers who kids were jumping up and down in his classroom and, you know, uh, um, just wouldn't behave no matter what he tried, and he ended up leaving, but, early in that year, but it was really on me, it was my fault, I didn't have it figured out, and so by Thanksgiving in that first year, the teachers were like, "Look, I get it, I remember saying, when I raised my own children, I wouldn't say to them, 'Hey, I'll give you $1 if you're polite to the UPS guy.' No, I want them to be kind people. So why should we do this reward and punishment? It undermines it undermines students' independence, but it wasn't working. And so we did institute a demerit system. And I said, okay, but it'll be temporary. Well, that temporary lasted many years. But the whole time I was saying, we're going to figure it out. We're going to figure it out. And then finally, um, we had, by the way, beautiful behavior. We were very adamant that we wanted to be respectful of children and respectful of childhood.
Mm.
So no treating kids like little robots or little soldiers, but they were being managed, very definitely. And so, but I kept looking, searching, and eventually we met Carol Lieber, who had devised this concept of restorative accountable discipline. Now, she lived down the block from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. when he was doing these group meetings.
Hmm.
And she said that she got some of her ideas from participating in these meetings. She's a very cool lady. And she taught us restorative accountable discipline. Now, restorative discipline is well known, but it's also misunderstood a lot. And but but long story short, and we also met other people along the way who taught us, many other people. And it turned out, gosh, some of these ideas had been around 30, 40 years. I just hadn't been exposed to them. And again, that's another reason I wrote The Well-Educated Child, because that's crazy that I spent years in graduate school and didn't even know,
Right.
hadn't been taught some
It,
of these
it wasn't something,
brilliant.
it wasn't part of the curriculum, right? It wasn't
Right.
something that they even discussed. Like those two things are different. Educating students and behavior of students were just two separate things. So, yeah. So no teacher really is exposed.
Right. And if they are, then it's one extreme or the other.
Right.
Right? It's either here's how to manage and micromanage kids, or here's this very aspirational structure, but then you try it and it doesn't work. So it took us years, but we finally put together a set of structures
Mm.
that, had kids behaving well, but independently. And the final epiphany was, behavior is not the ultimate end goal. It's not the be all end all. It's a means to an end. And the ultimate goal is agency.
Mm.
In other words, instead of managing students, you want to create the conditions in which students will learn how to manage themselves.
Mm.
Instead of holding kids accountable, you want to educate kids so they will hold themselves accountable. So they'll care about their own character. They'll care about behaving well because it's something they care about. How to figure that out is in the book.
Yeah.
Excuse me. How to
Yeah.
Understanding how to figure that out is a series of principles and practices that I describe in the book.
And there's a story that you tell in the book about a young man who he behaves really badly. I think he maybe pushed someone and he had to leave school and he came back and he talked through, he apologized and said, this is what I was feeling. And he apologized to the teacher, he apologized to the student. And it was remarkable because I was reading it thinking, if this were in a public school, this kid would have just been out. He would have just been out. There would have been no restoration of him integrating back into the school. I thought it was very powerful.
This is one of the misunderstandings or misperceptions of restorative practices. People think that it's permissive, it's not. People think that it's instead of consequences, it's not. And that's why I love that Carol named it restorative accountable discipline. There is a consequence, but that's not good enough. Because how is that going to transform the child's attitude so that they won't repeat the bad behavior or help them with whatever it is that was causing it in the first place in a supportive way. So, yes, there's absolutely a consequence. And if you hit someone, you are suspended. Of course but just that and nothing else, that's not really particularly instructive. And after all, we're educators. So there is a process where they are asked to undertake a very serious reflection in writing based on a sequence of questions that are deliberately set up to help pre-adolescent and adolescent kids, and the younger ones it's done a little differently, to help students really come to understand what's going on with me. What do I need to change? What do I want to change? What do I need to do? How do I make this right? How do I make it right with the people I hurt? What am I going to do differently next time? It's a process, and they grow
Right.
as people. They grow in their emotional intelligence. And, this young man went on to he loves talking about it, a Columbia University summer college program, and then got into a great four-year college, and, could have been, had it not been for all the care and love that our amazing teachers and staff put in to the students, could have, in another school, been one of the dropouts, right?
Right.
So it's a very serious and substantive process. It's not at all what people sometimes misunderstand it to be. And I talk a lot about examples of how we made the restorative practices concrete and effective. A lot of stories and ideas about that in the book.
Yeah, it's definitely a user-friendly roadmap framework for all of these ideas that we've talked about. And as I said earlier, I got the sense that you were always in the process of aspiring to more. So my last question is, what's next? What's next for you? What's next for Harlem Village Academies? Like, what's on the horizon?
We started the International Baccalaureate for the older kids. We're now beginning the process of bringing that into the middle school grades. We started the Montessori just as pre-K. We're now in the process of moving some of those ideas up into kindergarten, first grade. And this book is the beginning of our attempt to do our part to help share what we've learned with other educators. And so Christine Walkowitz, who's our amazing director of our Deeper Learning Institute, is working to expand the DLI, the Deeper Learning Institute, which is located in this beautiful brownstone right in between two of our schools. She's doing amazing work to bring that to more people, so that teachers who want to aspire to a higher level in their classroom, or groups of teachers in their schools, who care about deeper learning but don't quite know how to go about it, can start by reading the book, and then, we'll do everything we can to help spread the good word, because you know what? This is what children deserve.
It is. It is definitely what children deserve. It was very inspiring to read your book. Thank you for this conversation. And thank you so much, Dr. Kenny, for joining us on The Bells I Hear. Have a great day.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to the Bells I Hear podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe to The Bells I Hear and follow us on social media. We post all of our conversations on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple. You can connect with us on Instagram and post comments or questions that we can address on upcoming shows. More information can also be found on Blogger and Substack. So many ways to learn about the issues surrounding housing insecurity. Please join us and contribute to the conversation.